Hello and welcome to this session. The session is entitled How Healthcare Funders Can Navigate Rapid Changes in Healthcare Knowledge from an Actuarial Perspective. And it is hosted or led by Ryan Helt Nauhaus. I hope I said that correctly. Thank you very much.
There we go. Treatment declined. Come on. No. Mom wins court battle against medical scheme. Insurance denied cancer medication. Oncologist warns of dangerous insurance interference in cancer care. How do these headlines make you feel? Uncomfortable? Despondent? Do we believe denying funding treatment is justifiable? Or should all treatment be freely funded? Funders are constantly bombarded with requests for new treatment due to rapidly evolving technology. How rapid are those changes? According to experts, the doubling rate of healthcare knowledge is about 73 days. This means that the quantum of healthcare data knowledge is doubling every 2.5 months. At the same time, the half-life of this information, which is the time it takes for half of this knowledge to become outdated or superseded, is currently 12 to 18 months and is predicted to reduce further. This poses challenges to every player in the healthcare industry, including healthcare funders. As healthcare knowledge changes, so do best practices with regards to patient treatment, as new ways of diagnosing and treatment conditions emerge. Healthcare funders need to stay updated to make sure that their funding rules remain relevant for patients. What are the risks? You can imagine two extreme scenarios. One where a healthcare funder decides not to fund any new treatment. This can lead to denying patients access to potentially life-saving treatment, as illustrated in those headlines. On the other hand, if you have an overly generous healthcare funder who funds every new treatment that is requested, this funder will soon run into financial trouble. In addition, this position may not always be in the best interest of the patients, and funding ineffective treatments can lead to poorer health outcomes. So how do we decide, How do we decide which way to go? Requests for funding can come from patients and providers directly, or a medical scheme's managed care provider presents new treatments that are not covered under the existing rules. Once information is presented, the scheme immediately has two questions. Should we fund this treatment, and how much will it cost? I've been asked a few times whether this topic isn't more relevant to health economists than actuaries. And it might be, but I've seen hardly any health economists in the board meetings where these questions were asked. Yet in every board meeting where I was present, there was a healthcare actuary. And when these questions were asked, everyone looked expectantly at me. So there is an expectation that actuaries have the skills and knowledge to answer these questions. These two questions are not the same, even though they're usually asked in the same breath. The answer to the second question is dependent on the answer to the first one, but these are two distinct questions, and we will deal with them separately. Health technology in this context includes the application of organized knowledge and skills in the form of medicines, medical devices, vaccines, procedures, and systems developed to solve a health problem and improve quality of life. In that way, health technology assessments play an integral part in the assessment of new technologies. HTAs are defined as a systematic evaluation of properties, effects, and impacts of health technology, which is exactly what we are after when we want to answer the question of whether it makes sense to fund a new technology. HTAs are a multidisciplinary process designed to determine the value of a health technology at different points in its life cycle at both the individual and the population levels. During the process, different aspects of the new technology are considered, such as clinical effectiveness, safety, and financial implications. The ultimate purpose of HTAs is to promote an equitable, efficient, and high-quality health system, which is something we all want. HTAs are processes that depend on data and analytical resources. Therefore, as with any other process, you can't have it all. If you want results really fast, with a lot of certainty, you're likely to spend a lot on resources. Conversely, if you don't want to compromise on certainty, you are unlikely to get results anytime soon. This is to illustrate the trade-offs that exist within these assessments. Actuaries should not necessarily start conducting HTAs, although I do think it could be really interesting work. However, knowing where to find and being able to interpret HTA information should be part of every healthcare actuary's skill set. To make the point stronger, here's a list of uses of HTAs, which are relevant to almost every healthcare actuary in some or other way. Because it is about more than just saying, yes, you should fund this technology, it is also about designing care pathways, informing benefit design, and developing reimbursement models, all of which the results from HTAs can help us with. So what does an HTA process look like? First, a context needs to be defined, which is about the questions that need to be answered, the perspective that is taken, and the scope of the problem. Then relevant data is collected. This can relate to primary data, such as clinical trials, but may also include secondary data, such as academic and grey literature and existing HTAs. The analysis is a key component of the process, where after the outcomes are evaluated. At this stage, value considerations will be brought into the discussion. Most HTAs end with a recommendation regarding the funding decision with reasons for this recommendation. Decision makers, such as healthcare funders, then make use of the HTA outcome to decide whether or not to provide funding for the appraised technology and under what circumstances this technology is funded. The parties conducting the HTA are usually separate from the decision makers. For example, in the UK, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence conducts HTAs and makes recommendations to the NHS, but the funding decision still sits with the NHS. In the case of South Africa, it is even more fragmented. As actuaries, we are most interested in the analysis processes. The assessments should include a clinical analysis. After all, if a healthcare technology is not effective, why should we even be talking about it? The financial implications are most just as important. Not all HTAs are conducted on primary data, and often the information in previous HTAs is considered for reference or as input data. Lastly, HTAs consider the feasibility of new technologies. For example, it does not help if you approve funding for robotic surgery if none of the local surgeons know how to operate the machine or if the theatres are too small to accommodate it. The economic evaluation is very much what you would expect based on your F100 notes. The most commonly used analyses are the cost-effectiveness analysis and the cost-utility analysis. The main difference between the cost-effectiveness analysis and the cost-utility analysis is the outcome variable. In the cost-effectiveness analysis, the outcome variable is a specific measure, such as cost per hospitalization or admission rate, whereas the cost-utility analysis uses a general outcome measure, such as quality-adjusted life years or disability-adjusted life years averted. The advantage of the cost-effectiveness analysis is that it uses a tangible outcome that funders can easily relate to, but these measures do not necessarily account for the full benefit of the technology. Conversely, the cost-utility analysis includes a larger aspect of the overall benefit, but can be as abstract and difficult to quantify. To compare two treatment alternatives, the cost-effectiveness analysis and the cost-utility analysis use the same approach. The incremental cost-effectiveness ratio, ICER, compares the relative cost to the relative gains in utility or effectiveness. As the name suggests, it is just a ratio, which is the additional cost for each unit of utility gained. The ratio needs to be compared to a predefined threshold to help with the decision making. If the ICER is below the threshold, which means that treatment I is relatively cost effective over treatment J, the technology is likely recommended for funding, whereas if it is above this threshold, it is more likely rejected. Alternatively, the threshold can be used to determine the price at which the treatment becomes acceptable. You probably ask yourself, what would an ideal threshold be? In Thailand, for example, if the cost per QALY gained is below the average GDP per capita, the new technology is considered acceptable. In the UK, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence has used £20,000 to £30,000 per QALY gained for a number of years. In a document issued by the National Department of Health in South Africa, a threshold of 38,500 Rand per DALI averted is suggested. So you can see that the threshold is not cast in stone, and it can be informed by the overall affordability within the system. The threshold we've just discussed can furthermore be used to calculate the net health benefit of individual treatments. This allows for the simultaneous comparison of several treatment alternatives. As the name suggests, the treatment with the highest net health benefit is the most cost-effective. To make it more practical, here is a fictitious example of several treatments. In practice, medical schemes often fund more than one treatment for the same or similar condition. This may be required for practical reasons, even though only one treatment modality will produce optimal results. You can think about it this way. You can treat appendicitis either through an open laparotomy or endoscopically. Maybe endoscopic procedures are the optimal treatment, but not all hospitals are equipped to perform endoscopic procedures, or patients and providers insist on a certain treatment for reasons other than cost effectiveness. These reasons include inertia in clinical practice, poor information, financial and other incentives, ability to pay, etc. In this example, currently 3 different treatments are funded. If the funder would only fund the optimal treatment, which would remain? That's right, treatment A. Now a new treatment is introduced, treatment D. For a funder that only funds the optimal treatment or only adds to funded treatment if the new treatment is optimal compared to existing treatments, treatment D would not be considered. And you may get healthcare funders that think like that. It is not necessarily wrong. However, there is a different approach. This approach considers the market share of the different treatment modalities for that specific funder to calculate the overall weighted average net health benefit, where the weights are the market share for both the expected outcome and the expected cost. To calculate the net health benefit for the scenario including treatment B, we need an assumption regarding the likely market share once funding for treatment D is approved. As you can imagine, the results are quite sensitive to the assumed market shares, which is a major disadvantage of this method. So even though treatment D is not the optimal treatment, the overall net health benefit of the population is improved if treatment D is funded. Based on the figures used in this example, treatment D would be funded where funder takes the latter approach. This example illustrates how funding decisions may differ depending on the underlying philosophy of the funder. Here is a short summary of the requirements for the economic evaluation. As you know, half the battle is won with a well-defined problem. It is therefore important to specify the problem, defining which patient populations and indications are being considered, all relevant comparators, and the definition of alternative options. Then the available evidence base needs to be identified and integrated in a systematic manner. The comprehensiveness of the analysis needs to be weighed against time and resource constraints, bearing in mind that a selected subset of evidence may potentially produce misleading results. It is important that the assessment is available at the time when the decision has to be made, while considering the cost impact of various approaches. As with any actuarial calculations, there is uncertainty involved. Therefore, there is a risk that uncertainty in the estimates of cost effectiveness leads to the possibility that the wrong set of interventions is funded. It is important to understand where the uncertainty arises so that it can be dealt with appropriately. Sources for uncertainty include internal and external validity concerns. If there are internal validity concerns, the causal effect between the treatment and the outcome is questionable. If there are external validity concerns, the generalizability of the results is questioned. Other uncertainties may arise from selection bias, missing data, modeling uncertainty, or parameter uncertainty. As actuaries, we already know how to deal with these, which is through sensitivity and scenario analysis, statistical distributions, and confidence intervals. Even though HTAs are really useful in determining whether a new intervention should be funded, they don't come without challenges. You can just imagine how resource-intensive HTAs are, given their extensive data and analysis requirements. As actuaries, we appreciate that the required data may not always be available, accurate, and complete. From the discussion on the cost effectiveness and cost utility analysis, we have picked up that HTAs may not always capture all possible benefits of a treatment or technology. There are qualitative considerations that hardly ever make their way into the quantitative analysis. Another important consideration for HTAs is the time horizon over which costs and benefits are compared. Some benefits may only be realized much later in the patient's life, but there is no guarantee that this beneficiary will still be with the medical scheme for as long as it takes for the benefits to be realized. It is therefore important to choose a suitable time horizon for the purpose of the analysis, which can be tricky. Lastly, many countries, particularly in the developing world, lack the expertise to produce or even to use HTA information effectively, which limits the HTA information available in our context. There is a wide range of factors that need to be considered when a funding decision is made. This is where multi-criteria decision analysis, MCDA, can assist. MCDA in healthcare is a systematic approach that helps decision makers compare and evaluate different options, like healthcare interventions and technologies, based on multiple, potentially conflicting criteria. Where we've been involved in funding decisions previously, we know how these discussions can go. The managed care provider presents a new intervention that should be funded. Then the discussions go round and round in circles, with everyone trying to make sure that all perspectives are considered. At the end, the decision either gets deferred or is based on what feels right at that moment. The decision may well be different on a different day. When I came across this concept of a multi-criteria decision analysis, I thought this may be really useful in funding decisions like the one I was just referring to. Some medical schemes use a similar approach when approving ex gratia requests, where a number of data points are collected. They are scored and weighted, and a formula is applied to calculate the funded amount. The same principles can be applied in funding decisions of new, innovative treatments. Furthermore, the transparency of this approach helps with stakeholder buy-in, potentially preventing those negative headlines. There is a lot of value in sitting down with the medical schemes we are working with and discussing with them what criteria they want to be included in the evaluation, how they are scored and weighted, and then develop a formula. This is a once-off exercise, just like developing the ex gratia formula. Once the approach is agreed, it helps us to better answer the question of whether or not a new treatment should be funded. In addition, the scorecard will tell us what information is required so that we know what to focus our analysis on. MCDA has the additional advantage that it can explicitly deal with uncertainty by adjusting the scores or weights, or both. The first question of my clients was, so what criteria do other schemes include in their analysis, and how many criteria should we use? Here's a short list of the most commonly used criteria. The most common criterion is health outcomes, which is included in virtually every analysis. This makes intuitive sense. One of the papers that I used in this research investigated 228 studies on decision-making in healthcare. They found that the average number of criteria in MCDA is 4.8, with an average of 13.7 sub-criteria. This is just to give you a sense of what other entities are doing, what is normal, but we should take into account the unique circumstances of the medical scheme in question to inform our own MCDA, bearing in mind that a larger number of criteria further increases the data requirements, making the application of the MCDA more complex and potentially compromising the quality of the results. This shows a broad overview of how MCDA can be applied in practice, which provides a structured approach to decision-making. MCDAs are flexible in that criteria can be selected and weighted to describe aspects that are important to the funder or decision-maker and are structured according to the context and purpose of the decision. The MCDA helps to answer the question, should we fund this? Now that we've addressed the first question, we can turn to the second question. How much is it going to cost? Just because a certain treatment or technology is cost-effective does not mean that funding treatment or technology is affordable or sustainable. We still need to perform a budget impact analysis to determine whether funding of a certain treatment is affordable for the funder in question. We just need to open the CMS annual report to realize that all medical schemes are not equal. They cover different populations and have different reserve levels. Therefore, what is affordable for one scheme may not be affordable for another scheme. What does a budget impact analysis entail? To conduct a budget impact analysis, we need to include all relevant costs, which are sometimes not that easy to identify. The direct costs are usually the easiest to find out. Then we have to add the costs of related diagnostic tools, associated technologies, and care pathways. That will give us the total cost of the intervention. Similarly, we need to find out how often the intervention is funded. For that, we need to know the eligible population. This estimate will be based on prevalence or incidence rates, depending on the context, bearing in mind that the effectiveness of the treatment or suitability may differ by subgroups. For example, it may depend on age or disease progression. This needs to be allowed for. Then lastly, we need take-up rates and discontinuation rates, especially if it is a longer-term projection. One of the tricky things is always to decide on a suitable analysis period. Medical scheme budgets are typically done 1 year at a time. So if you want to know how much to budget for the next financial year, you should choose a 1-year period. However, it can be useful to show the financial impact for a longer period, especially if we believe that take-up rates and therefore costs will increase over time. Remember having to balance certainty, resources, and urgency. Given the rate of change in healthcare knowledge, long-term results are often not available at the time when funding decisions need to be made. For that reason, funding models were developed that address the uncertainties in a technology's performance, or at least manage the financial risk associated with its adoption. These models are collectively known as managed entry agreements, which are defined as a negotiated arrangement between a manufacturer of healthcare technology and a funder that facilitates patient access to new, innovative, and often expensive interventions. Most of us are already familiar with managed entry agreements, even though we might not have called them by that name. Here's a list of the various categories of MEAs that exist. This slide provides an overview of the range of agreements that are available. They each have their own advantages and disadvantages, and are suitable in some circumstances and not in others. You will also note that South African legislation will make some MEAs more suitable in our environment than others. The financial-based agreements focus on managing the financial risk, while the outcomes-based agreements focus on addressing uncertainties regarding treatment performance. Many of these agreements can be combined so that they are tailored to the specific needs of the funder and the technology in question. There was research conducted on the best practices that result in successful implementation of MEAs. Any successful agreement requires trust between the parties involved. MEAs are no different. Since healthcare funders' primary aim is to maximize population health, the agreements should focus on the needs of the patient. If an outcomes-based agreement is used, the outcomes have to be clearly defined from the outset to avoid disputes at a later stage. Good agreements explicitly deal with data uncertainties and allow for effective real-world data collection, evaluation processes, performance adjudication, and progress monitoring. It has been found that a shortfall in many managed entry agreements is the lack of exit criteria, which is at what point the call is made and under what conditions further funding will not be considered. This will also require an exit strategy on the funder's part. When we think about the practical implementation of MEAs, there are a few things that need to be taken into account. The agreement has to be compatible with existing systems and structures, or at the very least, the system has to be modifiable to accommodate the new agreement. As with everything in life, communication is key, which is the case here as well. There will be more buy-in from manufacturers, patients, and providers if they understand the funder's priorities and financial limits. As mentioned, exit criteria are essential in an MEA. The funder should be transparent about these criteria so that patients and manufacturers are not surprised when funding is withdrawn. I've been involved in several funding discussions where the decision was to fund the treatment or technology for now and to review this decision at a later stage. But there was very little discipline to actually sit down and review the decision. This may also be a result of a lack of resources to conduct the review. Therefore, the complexity of the MEA will be constrained by resource limitations of the funder as well as the other parties involved. So what does all of this have to do with actuaries? There are a few ways in which actuaries can play an active role. To evaluate new technologies and treatments, both at the outset and on an ongoing basis, requires data collection. This is something we're familiar with and can assist funders with practically. Once the data is available, it needs to be analysed. We not only bring data analysis skills, but also an understanding of the broader context and implications. In order to answer the two questions that come up in funding decisions, we can assist funders in the sourcing and interpretation of HTAs. These HTAs then further assist with estimating the budget impact and assessing the impact of any decisions on the funder's sustainability. With a broad understanding of the available MEAs, we can help funders to design and implement funding models that meet their needs and requirements. As part of this, we can design reassessment and exit criteria that are measurable and meaningful. We currently work in a very fragmented industry, with every funder trying to reinvent the wheel on their own. As a profession, we can encourage a unified and consistent approach to maximize population health, not just on a scheme level, but at a national level. Now that we are armed with this knowledge, we can ensure that funding decisions are made on an informed basis, even though this may still mean that not every request for funding is approved. Funding is provided in such a way that overall population health is improved. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're going to open the floor to questions. If I can just see by show of hands questions that exist. And there are roving mics that will come to you. I see one here in front and a second one over there. Given where you guys are at, let's go the other way around. So you can proceed and then we'll come to the front.
Thank you so much for the presentation. It's Pierre from Insight, just asking around one or two practical examples. I mean, I'm always fascinated with the new technologies that come out and whether or not they should be funded. Have you applied in this framework to any of those like actual examples?
So I find it most useful when you think about treatments for rare diseases. So some of the cardiac interventions that are really expensive and only applicable to a few patients, and you get these requests to fund, so as a medical scheme, you get the request to fund the treatment, and you want a scientific basis on which to make the decision instead of just going, well, today I feel generous, let me fund it. And the other very practical example is oncology treatment. There's a wide range of treatment available, but only applicable often to a very, very small subset of patients. So I find the framework's not that useful if everybody should get it. It's a completely different way to think about it. But the funding arrangements, or even thinking about the cost effectiveness, more suitable for the rare treatments.
So I'm Roseanne Harris from Discovery. So first of all, congratulations on your paper. I think it's a really valuable addition to just the healthcare discussions in the South African environment. And I think your presentation also really clear, because it's a real challenge, this issue of cost effectiveness of treatment versus affordability of funding. And it's a problem, I think, for us as in the medical scheme space, but also nationally, and bearing in mind our country's affordability versus the global north. So I think really, really valuable. So I've got sort of three parts to my question, if I may. The first part is the point around governance. I mean, you talked about this issue of who is conducting the analyses versus who's making the funding decisions. So did you have some thoughts about how that could be applied in South Africa? I mean, you mentioned NICE. I mean, should we be advocating, for example, for there to be that kind of entity in South Africa, that the evaluation part is available to everyone, but the funding decisions separate? I mean, how do you see that structure? That's the first part. The second one was around, so the alternative reimbursement models, which, I think is something that we're actually lagging behind in South Africa in terms of embracing those. So, I mean, do you see any willingness, particularly on the pharma side, in terms of embracing those, and for, some of the high-cost treatments that you just mentioned? Mm-hmm. And then the third one, perhaps, I really like your idea of the profession advocating, as the Actuarial Society advocating for this, and I guess maybe as part of something that is taken up by the Health Committee, but maybe just what your thoughts are in terms of how that could happen.
Mm. Okay, I'll try and remember all three parts. If not, you have to ask again. On the governance side, so it just makes practical sense to me that there's one body conducting the assessments, because the outcome should be universal. Like, you can say this treatment works for 25-year-olds with stage 4 with this cancer, and that's applicable throughout. Another shortfall, especially of the much smaller funders, is how do you fund an HTA? So from that perspective, it just makes perfect sense to me to find some kind of central agency, and perhaps even expand it across Africa, because it's a massive shortfall across our continent. Now you have to repeat your second question. Yeah, so even the research papers, which obviously mostly come from Europe or America, a lot of the reimbursement models are very academic, and then they try and apply them in practice, and they're like, it ain't working. So yeah, I think start small, start somewhere, get buy-in from the manufacturers. It can be a win-win for both. Because also as a manufacturer, you invested all this money in this new technology, you want people to take it up, and if you make it easier for them to fund it, it just makes sense. So I found this one paper, I can't remember the number, but they had all these MEAs that I had on the slide with advantages and disadvantages, which was quite informative to broaden your mind on what is possible, because sometimes we get so fixed in what we know, fixed fees and per diems, and then we think like that's it, and then just to think further, and then it might just be a little tweak on something that we already have, and then driving that further. Yeah. And then lastly, so I think we as a profession are much closer together than different administrators competing with each other, but different medical schemes competing with each other. And that's actually why I put it there. I can't think of any other driving force to bring a more unified approach to funding decisions. And it's just a waste of resources, in my opinion, if everybody, as I said, try and reinvent the wheel every time there's a funding decision. Yeah. And bearing in mind that the ultimate decision might still differ by scheme. But if you do it on a scientific approach, as discussed here, it's justifiable. It's not just, oh, I had a bad day and I decided not to fund it, but to say these are the criteria, this is why the outcome is what it is. Yeah.
I think there's a question right there in front, and I see a hand over there, one at the back, and one here in the center.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm Sarika, I'm from Discovery, and it's also, I work with Roseanne, and it's a topic that we're very passionate about. And it's really, really lovely to see your slides and how well you encapsulated this very complex topic. Just more a comment than a question, but we do a lot of work on this in my day-to-day job. So the one part I thought perhaps was missing, or you could consider in your presentation, was the opportunity cost. And there's a quote from the WHO, and I always use it on all of my slides, that every decision of what to fund is an implicit decision of not to fund something else. And even if you're looking, at a subset of rare diseases and that. Funding that one treatment for one patient means you're not funding something else for something else for somebody else. And we need to ensure, though, that I think in the medical schemes environment, we are constrained by the PMP package. So unfortunately, we cannot apply HTA to everything, but we should be. We have to understand we're operating in a fixed, we've got a fixed budget, right? We've got a constrained environment. And we need to make sure every healthcare intervention included in that benefit package has a reason. And we cannot just be adding things on top, or because you've got more reserves, you can fund this year, but then next year you can't. It doesn't work like that. And I partially attended that HTA symposium that was held at the National Department of Health, and they are moving towards that, and I think they're a bit more diligent in applying that thinking in the public sector, because they do understand that they've got a very limited or constrained budget. So what's in there and what they fund is informed by these decisions. But in the medical schemes environment, it's very, very different, because there's this thinking that there's this unlimited pool of money, which is not the case. And the opportunity cost is critical, and we need to always consider that when making any funding decision. But thank you so much.
Well, good. I think there was a hand towards the back there. That gentleman there at the back.
Thanks once again for the wonderful presentation. I have a question around HTAs. From what I have seen, it seems they are often done when you bring products to market. And I haven't seen instances where they actually do a review after 2 or 3 years to match or to test if their decision was correct. Because if it's with rare diseases, for example, when they start, it's obviously based on very limited data points. And then when that product is in the market, one would actually want to do a more comprehensive review to see if it's effective. Your comments on that, do you think maybe we are best placed to do it as actuaries?
Are we best placed to perform HTAs? I think there's some aspects of HTAs that we are best placed, especially the data analysis and understanding the fuller context that data scientists sometimes lack. I don't think we are best placed when it comes to the clinical analysis. That's why it's a multidisciplinary process. We need other disciplines in there. I think it's a general shortcoming across the globe that we have so little discipline in reviewing decisions. And I think it's not just in healthcare, it's everywhere that we're like, okay, we made this decision, let's move on. The next 10 problems are already waiting for us. And like I said, sometimes it is that you are forgetting about it, but sometimes also just a lack of resources. Should I reconduct this HTA that cost me millions of rands instead of evaluating a new treatment that might be useful? In terms of long-term results, this is where the managed entry agreements are coming in. It is a huge problem because sometimes these treatments claim like the benefits come in 10 or 20 years, but we know in 10 years there's new treatment to treat this. And so that's why I think it's so important to track these outcomes and have those exit criteria to say, if in 5 years I haven't seen exactly this, don't come back to me and tell me, no, we just need another year, then we'll see the better outcome. Pull the plug and move on. Again, it requires a lot of discipline. It's not easy to tell your patients you're stopping funding their treatment. And that's why you need those criteria up front, that everybody knows what you're going to do.
Thank you. I think there is another question at the back. I think the person already has a microphone.
Hello. Okay, it's working. Hi, I'm Himmel from MedScheme, and Charlton stole my question, so I'm going to change it slightly. I've also often seen HTAs being done by clinical professions like new drugs being done by pharmacists, surgical stuff being done by surgical doctors. How can we as actuaries demonstrate our values to these existing teams to prove that we can be a part of this process and add value to it when they already exist and are operating and seem perfectly fine with us just asking us to extract data?
That's a good question. I'm generalizing, but many doctors or clinicians are not trained in data analysis. So that's an angle that you can spin and say to them, you know, how do you conduct your analysis? Can I assist you? Can I help you? Also, we can bring a different perspective. Clinicians have a certain perspective for a very good reason, and we don't have that perspective, but we bring a different perspective. And I do think you need as many as possible perspectives at the table during the process. Make the call, move on. But yeah, I do think, especially healthcare actuaries that understand how the healthcare system works, what the compromises are, the opportunity costs that we're dealing with, I think we have a lot of value to add.
All good. Just checking if I see a hand over there.
Thanks, Ryan. It's Andre from Life Healthcare. So maybe more comments, maybe see what you want to add to it. So the one was, I think what actuaries also add is just, dealing with uncertainty and complexity is something that we're well equipped with. The other one, in terms of funding, so I mean, with these decisions, you obviously want independence, right? You want an objective decision. So obviously, the funders aren't going to trust studies produced by the manufacturers. But what we've seen is, I mean, I was on the sidelines of a health economics practice being set up. And the only people who were willing to pay for HTAs were funders who just needed an independent party to do the work. So the funding is a problem with these things. And I think from the funders' point of view, there's also this worry, right, that because you would think if a new technology comes in and it's better than the existing, that it would replace the old treatment, but that's not what we see. So there are good reasons to have multiple treatment options, right? But sometimes I think not enough thought is going into things like protocols of like, you know, this should be second line treatment, not first line, and all of those complexities.
Yeah, I think, you know, just to talk to your last point, those care pathways, you know, the funder, you have a certain idea, but sometimes the reality on the ground is different, and I think that's where providers and funders have to just start working much closer together. In terms of which party should conduct the HTA, I came across an interesting paper that asked exactly that question. There are some advantages of the manufacturer performing their own HTA. They have more data, they know better what they're dealing with compared to third parties that might not have the same insight, but perhaps the level of independence. So yeah, even the paper was like, well, both work. And I think what the paper also concluded with is just be aware of the biases that come with the HTA by whichever party has conducted it, and take that into account when you analyze the results and outcomes.
Just checking for a last round of any questions. Looks like you're off the hook. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your questions, and thank you once again.